Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
Welcome everybody to this episode 4 of Beyond the Crime, your semi-monthly deep dive into forensic schema therapy, all things forensic schema therapy. I've got with me today Dr. Lars Madsen and Shay Addison. I'm Rob Brockman.
G'day, hello, guys. Rob.
G'day, guys.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Rob.
Hey,
hi,
guys.
everyone. Hi, Lars. Good to be back.
Good to be back. It's been a little bit of a break. We had a few stop-starts, Christmas and all these things. We've got a full lineup coming for 2024 for the pod.
Very exciting.
Absolutely. And for today, in episode 4, we'll be looking at the topic of sexual sadism and offending.
It's a heavy topic. I think sadism is something that if you're working in a forensic space, you're going to come across more often than not. I remember early on in my career, I was a psychologist working in a prison, and I had to do an assessment on some individual. I can't remember whether I actually was assessing him or I just had to write up a report on something. And it was my first experience of an individual that meet the criteria of a sexual sadist. It was mind-boggling in terms of actually trying to understand or make sense of this person's behavior. So he had started at a very young age, torturing animals, insects and ants initially, and then had graduated to larger animals, cats and dogs, and then even sort of farm animals. And somewhere along the line, his behavior became sexualized, possibly when he was about 14 or 15. At that stage, I had only really been exposed to that level of violence, I think, towards other living beings in a conscious and deliberate way through media, right? Like through fictional stories and that kind of thing. So it was extremely shocking. But since that time, I mean, I have become increasingly sort of
desensitized.
Desensitized, perhaps. No, I don't.
Right.
But you have started to notice it, and there are different presentations, I think, of sadism that you come across when you're working as a psychologist or a therapist with forensic issues. And I'll just sort of mention them now, and we can talk a little bit more about them. So one very common presentation, a sadistic presentation that I've encountered in psychotherapy with forensic clients has been so one of the things that I will ask individuals is, as part of my standard questions is something to the effect of, well, do you ever find yourself fantasizing about hurting people? And this is usually where people will start to talk about it. And it's interesting that so many men, and it's usually men, will describe very detailed fantasies of hurting specific individuals. And what I noticed is that there was a presentation where this seemed to very much come from individuals who had a significant trauma history, where there's 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 specific abusers that hurt them when they were in their childhood, and they're quite traumatized. They would tend
to be quite prolonged, Lars. Like, is it a situation
So these would generally be not one-off incidences, but
like a kid's stuck in a situation.
Absolutely. So they would actually be this traumatized, awful home environment where they're isolated and they're hurt by 1 or 2 people continuously over a period of time. And as adults now, they have all these associated mental health problems, but also problems with crime. And when you sort of talk to them about these sadistic, violent fantasies, they're always directed at these individuals. So they will fantasize about them, and they will fantasize in.
So they're at the core of this violent piece, the anger and the schemas of things like mistrust, abuse, is wrapped up in these core memories of being helpless, feeling abused.
And you can very much see that actually these sadistic violent fantasies are a compensation response, a coping response to the trauma that they feel. And they will talk about that when they're in their cell or wherever they are, and they get triggered, or they remember, or they get reminded, then they will actively cultivate these fantasies and feel very different inside. They will feel powerful, they will feel strong, they will feel more capable. So that's one presentation.
That's one thing. So can we stay there for a second?
Yeah.
So I've seen clients like this too, not like your ones, but I do get clients like this too, to a degree. Clients you might think of as antisocial or have an antisocial personality. And I've always conceptualized this as a part of a bully attack mode, almost as a precursor to actual violence, is fantasizing about violence. And sometimes the fantasizing about violence itself can be quite soothing. Sort of in their minds, they're like, it's going to be okay because I'm going to get them like this, you know. What do you think of that? Do you see that as a part of a bully attack mode?
Yeah, I would identify that the modes that are relevant will be the bully and attack mode, where there's a very detailed thinking through of violent acts and torture and those kinds of things. And absolutely. And then I would say that another mode that seems to be relevant is a kind of self-aggrandizer type mode, where, you know, they almost in these fantasies will big themselves up, you know, to compensate perhaps for the feelings of powerlessness and helplessness. So that I'm all powerful, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I'm more capable.
I mean, I've had guys that some people like this, I think, would very rarely be violent, often for reasons like maybe they are not particularly strong or big or, you know, good at fighting or something like that. So I wonder what you think of this. I've had guys who are really big on the fantasy aspect, but they're very light on the action aspect. They're not the type to go and have a fight or something, but they would engage more in the fantasy aspect. They go home and think about it and all those things a great deal. Then you get the guys who do a bit of both, or who are more prolific maybe in perpetrating violence. Like there's some aspect there, isn't there? Do you see people like that?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. And I think with these guys that I was talking about, they will have criminal histories, and their histories of violence won't be in some cases not very, very great at all. But these fantasies will be present and has been for a very, very long time. So it's almost like they retreat to them as a self-soothing mechanism for them during times of stress. So it seems perhaps very similar to what you're describing, except maybe further on down the
but your guys are, for lack of a better terminology, better at violence. You know, they end up in prison. They've been doing a lot of violence. They're in prison. My guys don't make it to prison, and because they don't act on those violent fantasies, you know, in general.
So they may have a much more, I mean, it may be about bodily characteristics. They're just little and they can't fight, or just the healthy adult is better developed, you know, that they actually have much better consequential thinking.
True.
And the
That's another
kicks in. So if they're in self-soother mode, because the violent fantasy soothes the wound, you know, but the healthy adult is always lurking there in terms of saying, you know, gosh, if you act on that, like, you know, your life is forfeit, basically. So they don't do it. Whereas the guys who are further down the, you know, antisocial end of the scale, and also live in a context where violence is acceptable, normalized, and in fact sort of promoted, they're much more likely to step over the fantasy line into sort of demonstrate bully and attack.
I think also with these guys who step into the violence, they have a much larger sort of impulsive child mode as well, and that manifests across their different areas of their life.
The thing I found with the antisocial guys that really go with the violence is usually some sort of adolescent memory where they've been really successful with it, you know, where they've turned the tables. Do you find that they have a core memory where they were powerless, and then they turned the tables and they were violent, and they became more powerful? Do you ever get that or not?
Yeah. Look, I definitely, it does resonate what you're saying. There are some guys who become very good at violence, but it's sometimes hard to disentangle how much of it is actually true and how much of it is them self-aggrandizing.
So some of it's just puffing up and.
Well, I mean, you will get guys who and you ask them, you know, are you good at fighting? And they, oh yeah, I'm the best fighter in the block. I'm the best fighter in the street. I developed my own style of fighting when I was growing up. Everybody would.
So it's clearly an aggrandizer, right?
Yeah. You know, like, so there's this, and you kind of think, well, wow, you know, that kind of lifestyle where there's violence and you're fighting week in, week, and you're sort of involved in that. Very rarely are there, I think, are you always successful? Because there's always someone that's bigger and better.
Totally.
And there's always someone, if someone's not bigger and badder than you, then people collaborate to get you. And that's where, you know, that's how it kind of works. So I think that
violence doesn't pay. This is what you're saying.
But in saying that, Rob, in saying that, like I will say, like we haven't talked about the guys that are right down the end here. These are the sexual sadists who, in a sense, are almost prepared to, in situations like that where it's about dominating and controlling environments, they're almost prepared to do anything, risk anything, personal injury to themselves, harm to other people, significant harm to the point of winning, of being out on top, of having control. And those guys there, they're in their own little ballpark and are terrifying to everybody else.
Oh, there's two things. I've just got a couple of little threads here.
Okay,
if I can just. So one of them is about reputation. So this is something that's come up a lot when I talk to forensic psychs. The idea of reputation. So to what degree? I'm looking at you now, Lars. Lars is like, yeah, I know about this. So that seems like its own thing. Like a lot of this behaviour is like, I want to maintain my reputation. Can you say a few things about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Context is king, right?
Context is king. I for a period of time, for about 10 years, was evaluating men that had ended up in a maximum security unit because of their violence. And I would hazard a guess that maybe 60% of the incidences of violence were related to this idea of reputation, of being called out. That's sometimes how it's described, or called out in front of the unit or front of other people, made to look weak, made to sort of put down in some kind of disrespected. Respect is a big word. One assessment that I had a number of years ago, the guy who was physically a smaller guy, but had a very long history in prison and was well known. And he considered himself as a bit of a go-to kind of guy, a mover and a shaker. And he'd been really, really violent towards some young guy that had come in, who had no history, was very meek in a sense. That's the sense that I got. It wasn't really a threat to this guy in any way. But what this guy had done is that he'd befriended him, right? And as they were sitting in the unit block, wherever they were, what he'd done is he'd had this tennis ball and he'd rolled it across to this guy, this heavy, right? So this was unusual behavior. He was, the guy, the heavy had just thought, my God, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're calling me out, right? And he started thinking that this guy is calling him out. He's disrespecting him. He's like sending a message to someone. So his paranoid over control is working overtime. And immediately what he then felt like he had to do was just to put it straight, right? So he attacked the guy, not in that moment, but at another time when there was privacy from the custodial staff, and seriously hurt him. And as he was hurting him, he was actually also apologizing to him, saying, look, man, I'm really sorry, but I've got to do this because if I don't, people are going to think I'm weak. People are going to think that you're calling me out as a dog.
Next time, don't roll the thing.
Yeah, you got to learn. You got to learn the rules. What you say and what you do, and this is just not what you're doing. So he really, really hurt the guy. And then afterwards, when he was in the maximum security unit and he was being assessed, he was very apologetic about it, but he was also very pragmatic in terms of saying, "Look, this is just what you have to do.
It had to happen. Otherwise, that could have been me. If anyone can call me out,
If anyone calls me out, then the guy next in line, so to speak, will think that he...
And especially, can I say, if this other guy is seen as like low rank or something.
Absolutely.
Like if that guy... No rank.
No rank.
That's a thing, no? I'm very naive, but that's a thing in the prison system. There's almost a ranking of who...
Oh, absolutely.
And if someone with no rank can be seen to call out someone like him, then this threatens. It's threatening.
Oh yeah, totally. So they also think with guys who come in, who don't have histories and aren't really known, there's this paranoia that they are that they're there to get information, to pinpoint who the heavies are, to pinpoint where the drug dealers are, that kind of thing. So
from the authorities, do you mean?
Yeah, from the police, from the authorities. I don't know how much that happens, but I do know that obviously guys talk to the intelligence inside prisons. So this rolling the tennis ball towards this guy in the midst of the whole unit, he immediately thought he's sending a message to someone.
This poor guy just really dropped the tennis ball, like, kind of thing.
He like a totally innocent kind of guy. No, just naive, right? He's just a guy.
I'm pretty sure the tennis ball was gone after this. It was sort of
he learned
more tennis ball, but
just stay away from the.
But
tennis
it does
ball.
bring up another point for me, because what you're saying, and Shay, you said it straight away. You said context is king, Rob. Right.
Yeah.
So, but what you're saying
is, if we circle back to something you said before about, guys, you mentioned about, the environments that sometimes people who develop sadistic fantasies grow up in. Context is king, because as young people, young kids and teenagers, they're constantly triggered. Think about it from a schema point of view. They can't escape the environment. So the necessity to rely on a method of soothing that or dealing with whatever's going on is ever present, like on a daily basis. Fast forward to jail, much like prison. If you're stuck in jail, right, and you're surrounded by people who are genuinely threatening and genuinely represent a risk to you, again, the context is such that you will perhaps be, relying on those sadistic fantasies and potential behavior, in order to just deal with the environment. If you're in a different environment, you're far less reliant on them.
So here's a question for you guys. So what you're saying on some level is that we have these guys who have problems with violence and they end up in jail. But what we do is we get them to go and hang out with other people who are violent.
Yeah. The environment.
You know what I mean? Like the context may not be the best to sort of rehabilitate violence. I don't know. What is that? Am I just stating the obvious?
No, it's definitely. I mean, but the thing is, what do you do, right? If someone does something really horrific, you got to send them to jail, but, jail's full of other people who've done similar things. But in the adolescent world, interestingly, like, the juvenile offender world, which is really hot topic up here in Brisbane at the moment, is that it's very well known that you don't stick them all together. They try to keep them separate because you don't want them to be associating with other juveniles or young people who have similar problems.
Well, it's all of that, but you got to think this is a violent context, right? This is the thing. Like, so this is reinforcing. Like, so they may be needing, in their mind, they need to keep this bully and attack mode, or they need to actually develop it even further, potentially. So anyway,
or they just get triggered, and that's just what happens. So I certainly have clients, in prison who feel really vulnerable all the time, and so they slip into their self-soothing, some of which can be quite, sexual, sadistic,
which is the fancy stuff.
And they're not able to act on that. So you get people who might be, pedophilic and sadistic. So in a prison environment, there's no sort of person they can perpetrate it on because there's no kids in there. But in a way, that process is continuously reinforced because it's in reaction to the environment, the environmental stresses a lot of the time.
So to bring it back to the sadism, sexual sadism piece, you guys have been talking about, we talked about bullying attack mode, and we started talking about sadistic behaviour and sadism. And then I guess we can extend to sexual sadism. Can you really define for me, guys, what is sadism versus sexual sadism?
So I would say that there are definitions. Like the whole concept of sadism is complicated, and we won't go into it because it's defined in different ways, and that's what
don't go into the controversy. But for you, say, what is sadism?
Okay,
like what are you using in your mind day to day?
So typically, when it's linking sexual arousal with sadistic behavior. So, for instance, because people can be violent in sexual behavior, but the violence is not the thing about the sexual behavior that is actually arousing to the person. So they may use physical violence, coercion, intimidation to gain compliance from a victim. Mm-hmm. That may use physical violence, coercion to hurt a victim because of a grievance, right? So it's not
this is just bullying attack. This is just standard bullying attack.
It's a means to an end, really.
Or they may use violence towards an individual to shut them up, to get rid of them, that kind of thing. I'm thinking if they, murder them in the context.
It's pragmatic.
It's pragmatic in that sense. The sexual sadists, they will be acutely focused on the experience of suffering and pain and trauma in the victim. So
and that's the arousing bit.
That's the arousing part. And if you ask them in interviews, someone who's very sexually sadistic, and as one of the things that you will do when you might be going through therapy with them is you're trying to make sense and unpick their behavior and decision making with regards to their offending. And one of the things that I often ask them when they're in the process of doing like a violent, sexual violent crime is like, what are you focusing on and what are you looking at? And often the sexual sadists will be looking at something. So it's usually, in some cases, it's the look of fear and terror in the victim. So they will be looking at that, and that's the thing that's powerful and arousing, plus controlling them and that kind of thing. So they are actually looking for these signs and symptoms that the person is struggling and overwhelmed. If the person, and this is what guys have told me, if they go simply completely blank, completely disassociate, disconnect, they just become numb, they become robotic, that doesn't work. Then they need to get them back into that space where they've got fear. And what they will sometimes do in this case, and you can see this behavior also in famous serial killer cases, because serial killers usually are sexual sadists, is that they will then they'll keep a victim and then they will give the impression that they're going to help them, that things are over, that things are resolved, that help is on the way, that this is all, they'll give them hope. And they'll give them that kind of hope, because what they will then do is actually then take it away from them as well, and then see that fear and trauma in the victim. Does that make sense, guys? What do you think, Shay? Is that kind of what you think?
Well, what you're describing there, I think, are the most extreme cases of it, and I think, it definitely happens. And I think probably the highlighted ones that get a lot of press coverage and cases that are well known, probably that kind of matches. I think there's also other types of sexual sadism that aren't perhaps as severe as that, and that are probably far less well understood just because they get less attention. And I always think one of the issues is, I guess, we are talking about like with the kind of serial killer type people who might just choose a person at random because they're just trying to fulfill a fantasy. They just want to act it out, versus people who will deliberately choose a specific person, perhaps, or the victim is far more meaningful to them. And there's, I think, something else going on there. You can get that kind of sexual sadistic behavior in men who perpetrate domestic violence, for example. They probably wouldn't do that to anybody else, but
it's just a partner, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that in those situations that the sexual component of that is part of the violence? It's part of as in, like, what I mean is they seek to use the sexual behavior to punish or hurt their partner, or because that's more humiliating. That's more, okay.
Yeah, definitely. Like the humiliating someone who they feel, their kind of vulnerable child is that feeling exploited and feeling that kind of stuff. And so it's like a massive overcompensation, and deliberately, you humiliate me, I will do it 50 times worse.
I mean, you've talked about terror, Lars, right? That for some it's the terror. And then Shay, you've brought up the humiliation, right? That actually the thing they're looking for are signs of being humiliated, degraded. They're slightly different things that you're looking for, no?
Yeah, I think one is connected to an interpersonal dynamic, so in a domestic violence type, intimate partner type situation where you might have someone behave in a sexually sadistic way. It's all tied up in that complex interpersonal dynamic. Whereas perhaps in what Lars is talking about, I would think more is probably akin to someone who's probably quite maybe more psychopathic, or that they have less of a specific person they're aiming it at.
Right. Or maybe this is the wrong word. They're sort of deflecting this behavior from somewhere where they can't do it to somewhere where they can. So maybe the anger and all that stuff's to do with your parents, your mother or something, but now you're taking it out on this poor woman or a stranger. Displacement. Yeah, displaced. Is that a thing with this, do you think, guys?
Maybe. I mean, when you look at the developmental history of folks who end up being assessed or identified as sexual sadistic murderers, I think there's a number of studies that have looked at the developmental history of these individuals, and they've found that generally there seems to be a theme where they grow up in home environments where they experience a great deal of emotional deprivation, perhaps physical abuse as well. They were very, an over-controlling, inconsistent, punitive home environment where mum and dad were unreliable or dangerous. It seems that early on, one of the ways that these individuals coped with that environment was to retreat into a very intense fantasy world as a way of dealing with it. And they end up being quite socially isolated and shy adults, and often feel misplaced and less than. So we can see that the schemas that are relevant for them. Yeah. And these fantasies emerge in that kind of context, or seem to emerge in that context. And it's, is it a displacement towards these omnipotent caregivers that are powerful and punitive? Well, you would think that there might be some truth there. I mean, what's been your experience, Shay or Rob? I mean, you've worked guys who sort of are maybe not right down that end of the spectrum, but
well, before you answer that, I'll let Shay answer that. Just one thing, I guess why I brought it up, you know, because Shay was sort of saying, look, with some offenders, it's about one person. So it might be like teaching my girlfriend a lesson, right? Versus someone who picks up a victim off the street and wants to just like outlet all this, you know, and it's a slightly different thing.
And that's right. There's different pathways as to how this kind of manifests. I think depending on the person's kind of depending on the context. I think a lot of the time, you know, so have guys who've had maybe horrific conflict in their primary relationship and it's all over and they're all chaos and angry and upset and wounded, and they'll, you know, go out and just randomly, viciously, sadistically attack, maybe rape someone in a park, you know, so it's a displaced anger. That person is literally in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, versus somebody who feels completely humiliated by a partner who might have broken up with them and now they're sleeping with the gym instructor down the street and they feel completely diminished and they fantasize about, well, I will, you know what, you want to do that to me? Look what I can do to you.
So that is a thing. That's a dimension, I think, like the degree of, you know, is it a specific behavior aimed towards their current networks, or is it something that's more displaced that they're sort of expressing outwards?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, so you definitely get those two different presentations. And in my experience, the extremity of the sadism sometimes is much, I've seen it much more so in where there's been an intimate partnership. Yeah. You know, so things where people they'll use objects.
So this is the old thing, like in the movies, they'll look at it and go, this is a crime of passion. Like this is someone who was very pissed off. Like,
yeah. And the humiliation aspect of how you might actually rape somebody is they will use objects. They will use things way beyond the means to actually achieve gratification. And so there's that kind of sadistic pleasure in just utter humiliation, and they might never perform that behavior on anybody outside of the context. So the risk, you know, therefore is to the intimate partner, versus somebody who's just got this broader, more generalized sadistic kind of way of being in the world, and potential victims could be many people.
I've got to mention something a bit off keel here because I think it's interesting and it contributes. There's a show called 1923, Yellowstone. Have you guys seen it?
No,
I've heard about it.
It's set in 1923, and it's sort of like, I think it's like Texas, or so it's those kind of states of America. And there's these guys that might be Arizona. This guy's got this big block of land, like massive. It's almost like half a country. You can imagine like 1 million acres, and he runs cattle and stuff.
A ranch.
Right, so that's the setting, right? But within, and I think it's one of the later episodes in series 1. It's either, you know, there's 8 episodes in the series. There's this kind of white dude, aristocrat, capitalist, right? And he's involved in a sort of, he's a nemesis of the guy that owns the ranch. Anyway, there's this scene where he runs into these 2 sex workers, right? And he shacks up with them for a period of time. And what he does is, it culminates over time. In the beginning, he whips one of them, right? So he's got this behavior, and this will dovetail into something, I think, a question about BDSM, like where does that lie? Mm-hmm. So he whips one of them. There's this scene, and he's very violent. He's got a whip, and it's more like a stick or something. And, you know, she thinks it's going to be a sexual thing, like an act, but then he pulls out this cane and then bang, bang, bang. Okay. And then this progresses. And then, the next time, he coaxes, the one that he whipped to whip her friend. Right. He says, that's what I want now. I want you to whip your friend. Right. So she whips her friend, and at first she's very reluctant. right? Because she's like, oh my God, that's my friend. And he eggs her on, and eventually she starts really whipping her, and almost kind of like too much and like enjoying it. And then, so the friend's been beaten up. And this is the piece that's I found very interesting and related to what we're talking about. Then he gets the whip and he goes, now you change sides. Like the one who'd just been getting whipped by the friend is the one now who takes the whip, right? And I guess, so I don't know, what do you think of that? To me, that was very like, wow, like his whole game. At the beginning, I thought he liked whipping the woman. I don't think it was like, it was the piece about, getting
manipulator in there somewhere, Rob.
Yeah, like, and getting the piece about getting one of them to get to the point where she betrayed the friend, and then so sort of that turning them against each other or something, and then the lady who'd been whipped was completely lost her crap, right? Just completely violent in that last act.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Okay.
I don't know. What do you think of that? But is that related to this stuff? Would this be?
That's very sadistic. I would say, yeah, absolutely. There's
completely,
like
right?
Power and control. It's like self-aggrandizing. Right? It's
to the point of I can make you guys whip each other and
that's right.
Humiliate and whip each other, and I'm in control
and betray your friend, and
sort of really kind of just remove and damage the connections that they have to each other and the loyalty, right? I mean, that's another level of suffering and power and control, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of classic. Well, so then clearly that went beyond something you might call BDSM, but is that worth talking about this stage? Like, what is there more normified versions of sexual violence? Is there a spectrum? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, BDSM, I guess, just to be very simplistic about explaining it, is where people consent to it, so it's not what we're talking about in our world. Normally are dealing with offenders who have been, done things against people's consent. But BDSM in that world is where you have people who derive pleasure from inflicting pain or seeing, somebody ostensibly suffer, but that the sufferer is consenting to it. So it's not a criminal offence. Is nothing. Yeah, there's nothing in that sense that you're coercing somebody. They're agreeing to it. And often it's quite a structured, there's guidelines around how to do BDSM. People don't just launch into it. There's a clear, it's a negotiated task. People have safe words. So the safe word would be, say, for example, with your whipping women, the woman would have been able to put a hand up and go, hey, whatever her safe word is, like bingo or whatever. Right. And the other person stops, right? That's BDSM, which is where they know they negotiate the limits, and they are consenting adults and doing that to each other because they find that pleasurable.
So as part in prep for this podcast, we did do some research on BDSM culture, because it somehow sits somewhere on the spectrum, doesn't it, in what we're talking about. And I'm just going to throw some stats at you guys and see what you think. So in some of the studies where they've looked at it in Germany, I'm not saying Germans are more into this than others, but also in Canada, people in very large population samples where they've asked them questions about their sexual behavior, 16 to 19% of people have reported an interest in or actually engaging in masochistic behavior. And 9 to 22% of these studies have engaged in sadistic behavior in the BDSM world. And the BDSM subculture world, right, there is, there's four kinds of things that people engage in, right? Four kinds of behavior. There's pain play, which is spanking and that kind of thing. There's humiliation, which is verbal debasement, physical restriction, bondage, and then hypermasculinity, where people are, adopting very sort of coercive, over-control-y type of roles. So there's those four types of things. And the most popular ones, apparently, according to this, is body torture and verbal humiliation. And people report, practitioners and the community individuals report that their motivation for doing it is the sense of community and the pleasure of concealing secrets and the limitless opportunities to self-expression and reinvention. So there's a real strong kind of sense of bond, perhaps, or connection with other folks engaged.
So these would seem to be like healthy adult driven values.
You would think so.
From the surface, like it's about connection and self-expression and autonomy.
Yep.
And it's just an expression of the breadth of sexual interest, really.
I wonder if they
mean,
ever attract the more sadistic kind of, they must have a way of policing this.
You think they would, wouldn't they? Yeah, you would.
You know what I mean? If Johnny goes there and he's sadistic, I mean, they must get people like this who they have to sanction or deal with.
Yeah, I think in those communities where it really is about a community and it's about let's all enjoy ourselves. The interests are just,
How do you know so
spectrum.
much, Shay? What's going on?
Along that
Shay's
spectrum,
like in that community.
Of course, you would have like a moderator, right?
A moderator.
You have a moderator going.
I'm guessing.
We're going to assess you and can you stick to the rules?
It might be interesting to get someone on the pod at some stage. Someone who might be
is part of it. Yeah. Maybe.
I mean, we're also making an assumption everyone knows what BDSM stands for.
Yeah.
Yeah,
some
Google
of us don't, Shay.
Google it if you don't.
Well, interestingly, now that we're talking about the psychosocial profile of BDSM individuals, 70 to 60% are university educated. They're usually in a stable relationship. They have good self-esteem and they're not sensitive to rejection. In fact, when they compare this cohort to non-BDSM, the BDSM community have greater psychological adjustment and interpersonal strengths.
So, look, just a possible interpretation. This is a group of people with very strong, healthy adult modes. Right?
Yeah, I mean, they're going into
that are quite a healthy sample, despite this behaviour.
Yeah, they're going into an environment where they're able to interpersonally negotiate something extremely delicate and extremely sensitive, so you would need good skills to be able to do that. And that's all about healthy adult, right? So maybe it develops, I don't know, strengths in them or skills in that population. Just the way they're applying it seems to be, is probably something that is a bit left of center for the average person, right?
Like broaching this for someone. So look, completely left field, probably naive question for you guys. Could some of this BDSM stuff for some people still involve something like that you would consider sadism, but expressed in a way that's more acceptable and healthy? Like another way of saying that, is it on a spectrum?
Yeah, I definitely think most human behavior is on a continuum, right? And I think that's just an example of it. I mean, we know in our field that sexual interest is just enormous.
Does that make sense, guys? Population. So, for example, and I must say, the dimensions, the types of BDSM that you mentioned seem to match up to, we were talking about humiliation, right? We're talking about inflicting pain on others. These are the sorts of things that show up in full-blown sadism as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So there is a sort of dimensionally seems a bit similar. I don't know. Does the question make sense?
Yeah. I would say that it absolutely does exist on a continuum. So we're looking at this kind of behavior is down the, obviously the low end of the continuum because it's make believe, right? It's pretend. Like all the practitioners, all the individuals involved have agency and control, although they might pretend that they don't have, but they do.
Yeah, they're consenting.
And there will be like rules and agreements as to how things are done.
So, but you see the point. Like these are maybe driven by like similar schemas. They're enacting out, but potentially, that these things, the idea of these things, the idea of humiliation is sexually arousing, and that might be true for some people engaging in BDSM, and it's true also for the more violent offenders.
Yeah.
One of them are expressing it in a way that's completely illegal and out of control and without consent, and others are doing that with others who might be interested with consent, etc.
Do you think, though, if we kind of think, what are the coping modes, overcompensating coping modes that are active when you're being sadistic? It would be the bully and attack, the over-controller, it would be the self-aggrandizer, right? And if you think about that, those kinds of modes generally feel quite good to be in. Like you're capable, you're
empowered.
Yeah, that they're powerful, strong, positive emotions. So you can think that if you are able to kind of activate these modes, right, in a controlled kind of context, in a fantasy context, then that would feel good as well, right?
Yeah, and pair it with sexual arousal. It's, like a fairly big pleasure trip, isn't it, really?
Mm.
That's what people are, quite possibly, I guess, what people are after. It's the function of it.
So there's all that. And then on top of that, it sounds like there's the sense of community and connection and all these other things that attract people into that. Okay.
Yeah,
So I think we're
I agree with you, Rob. If we circle back to the healthy adult, I think one of the big differences between, people that might engage in that kind of consensual world versus people who are offenders because it's what they're doing is criminal is just often in the criminal guys, it's just the healthy adult it's tough to find it sometimes. It's really underdeveloped, and so they sit in these overcompensating modes or coping modes the vast majority of the time. The healthy adult isn't present a lot.
All right. So we should probably need to move more into treatment aspects for folks that fall more within the sadism aspect, sexual sadism. What do we do with folks, guys? How do we provide some kind of treatment?
With the guys that I have worked with who have sexual sadism, it's one of the focus in our treatment is to help them be able to form more meaningful, stronger attachments to people that are more authentic and balanced. A lot of them don't have relationships where they feel genuinely understood and cared about. So there's a lack of attunement. There's a lack of feeling safe. There's a lack of feeling.
There's a lack of safe attachment. Right? These are people with maybe no safe, stable attachments.
Yeah. So it's almost like they've kind of opted out of expecting or wanting, or not expecting that you can achieve these kinds of things. I worked with a guy for a number of years who struggled with the sadism quite a bit in his relationships because he always needed to be in control. He always needed to be on top and couldn't tolerate any kind of vulnerability. And every time he did, he felt overwhelmed. So one of the things is being able to understand, I think, from a schema perspective, like what is the underlying trauma related to this stuff, and looking at trying to heal those schemas. For the ones that I've worked with, emotional deprivation is a very, very big one. Mistrust and abuse is a very big one. The sense of social isolation and alienation, a very big one. I don't fit in, I don't belong, no one cares, no one understands, and people hurt you. So you always need to be on, and you always need to be in control. So that's I think the emotional, psychological component of sadism that you sort of work at trying to turn if you think of it as a volume switch, kind of turn it down somewhat so that the need isn't so great or the desire for it isn't so great. But I have to say, when people have found this stuff really, really sexually powerful for many, many years, and some of these sadistic fantasies will emerge in adolescence and they'll be elaborated on and cultivated for many, many years, thousands of hours. I'm not sure that you can actually change someone's sexual interest in this regard. You can only help the person understand it and also manage it. Manage it, and not need it so much, perhaps.
Yeah. So there's two pieces to this, though. So you're talking about something that's universal in schema therapy, and that is that often we get to a point where we need to help our clients experience safe, stable attachments and connections. That's the kind of basis of treatment. That they're doing this thing because they don't have any safe, stable attachments. If we could get that happening in some way and going in the right direction, that would include safe, stable attachments that they're involved in, so that they could be a safe person for their partner as well. That they're not so controlling and all those things. They have better relationships. For some, that means starting from scratch. Like maybe they have no relationships. For others, that might mean being safer in their relationship. Providing more safety and less control, and being comfortable with that in their relationship. So there's this relational aspect. Yep. And I guess what you're saying too, though, is once there's been, 10 or 20 or 40 or 50 years of pathways of this is what I'm into, this might be hard to modify.
Yeah. And in that instance, Rob, I think it's important to mention, I mean, we would always incorporate the help of a forensic psychiatrist with men who have that, because the biological element of that stuff and managing, deviant arousal and that kind of stuff is important, because there are medications that can help. What we're trying to do is contain and delimit it, and there are other things you need to incorporate into treatment, and behavioral therapy as well, like aversion therapy, to help them not to continuously reinforce those fantasies.
So controversial question. I know we talked about BDSM, but yeah, maybe you know what I'm going to say. Is engagement in a healthier, consent-driven version of some of these things, such as BDSM, is this something you might encourage some of these guys to think about? If it's something that they wouldn't want to, they weren't able to completely modify, engaging in a more acceptable, legal sort of version of this. In other words, joining a community, is that something that comes up?
I can honestly say I've not had that in a particular client, but I can relate to the concept. It's kind of like harm minimization. If you've got a client that can manage the boundaries, could manage, the community expectation in there, it would probably be good for them. I would think, but you would have to feel fairly confident that they could, they weren't going to exploit that situation, that they were actually going to use it in a healthy way, not an exploitative way.
Would you ever encourage this? Like for somebody that they're progressing in therapy and they're looking for a healthy expression of these things, would you ever encourage this perhaps or make use of it?
If I felt they could manage it, yes. But that would but you'd have to be very careful, very careful.
I think the key thing is it's really based on the individual, right? And I guess their history and I guess their strengths and weaknesses, I think. Because I'd be very anxious about that if I'm recommending that for an individual who perhaps is maybe more psychopathic than the average individual, because I think that it's very difficult to sort of truly recognize or read these individuals if they've got a very significant history of violence in this way, and might revel in it quite a bit. So
makes sense.
My concern would be that they find themselves in the grips of a
reminds me of
situation, and then suddenly they just think
they flip into the old mode, and it's
they can't manage the boundaries. That'd be the problem.
Yeah, I don't care.
It reminds me of some people's substance use histories. There's no level of alcohol that they can they know that if they start drinking, like a harm minimization thing isn't really going to cut it.
You got some that just have to have abstinence. That's it.
Yeah, there are some and they know it and they've tried and they but any part of alcohol leads down this path. So maybe it's a similar metaphor,
Well, it's a similar thing when we work with men who have, issues with pornography, who might have stepped over the legal line as well. The same thing. You have some men who that's it. You just cannot ever watch porn again because it is such a slippery slope. Versus men who are much more capable with help and whatever to put boundaries around it, and they're able to manage adult pornography use, in a controlled way.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of concept. And you've got to be really confident, I guess, with your client and with your formulation around that to be able to recommend this or that.
Sort of abstinence versus harm minimization.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess how much healthy adults there.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Stability in their relationships, all these things. Yeah.
My experience with it is that there is a greater need for these feelings or these fantasies or this behavior when they feel emotional distress, right? And they may or may not be able to really tune into that. So they might feel very lonely, very excluded, very misunderstood, very defective or broken. And these fantasies are going back to what we talked about at the beginning of our podcast today. I think the drive to seek those kinds of fantasies and experiences out, I think, become amplified when they're not coping at an emotional level. And I think that if in therapy you're able to help that person deal with that, cope with that, understand that, heal it in some way, right? I think then the impetus to seek that stuff out becomes, the pressure isn't as great and they have more control over it, making their decisions and pursuing it.
Okay. Yeah. Is there any other treatment related aspects that you guys want to cover?
What do you think, Rob? In your
one thing is how effective is treatment? Like what are, how effective does this sort of treatment tend to be for your offenders, for an offending population?
That's a good question.
I think kind of segueing back a little bit to what Lars said before is certainly with, people at the pointy end of the stick, is that once these, this kind of fantasy life and this reinforced kind of pleasure from that, that they get from sadistic fantasies has been in place for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It's a bit like pedophilia. It's like we don't expect to ever eradicate it. It's really about, you're talking about a management and containment process. And so you're constantly risk managing, I guess, in that sense. And it's like anything, but, with earlier intervention, I guess you probably have more success. But I don't know, I try to help with some of my offenders with things like this, using a diabetes analogy. I kind of say, no one wants diabetes necessarily, but when you got it, you have to be accepting of it's a long-term management issue. And if you follow all the things that are helpful, you can live a life without interference. But if you don't, you're going to get your feet amputated at some point, and trying to help set expectations around that. Because in my experience, I mean, you don't eradicate it, right? You don't remove it. I can't think of client where that's the case.
In the forensic space, there's a real danger around, the perception or the assessment that, this person's sexual sadistic problem has been cured. And that's nothing to worry about, because people who struggle with this and who are in the criminal justice system often won't volunteer that, and they certainly won't be sort of necessarily putting their hand up to say.
But that's a problematic narrative, isn't it? Like a red flag when your clients are saying, "Oh, it's cool. I've dealt with this. It's over."
It's all cured.
You don't want to hear that.
Because it's really unrealistic. It doesn't.
So what do you want to hear? The healthy adult says what? Like when someone who's doing well in treatment, he doesn't say, "I'm done with this. I've done the program. I'm cured." What do they say?
I would say that it's recognizing. So from a schema perspective, it's recognizing, for instance, maybe that I have a predator mode, or I have a bully and attack mode, I have a self-aggrandizer mode, and over-controller mode that I need to keep in check. I need to manage those parts of me, because if I allow them to drive the bus, so to speak, to use a metaphor, then, the bus is going over the cliff, and, it's happened in the past, and
it's running over people.
I'm here. What's that?
That's right.
It's running over people.
Yeah, running over people, right? So that's what I need to be able to manage. And I think the healthy adults, what does the healthy adult say? Well, he says something akin to that, or she says something akin to that, which is, I recognize I have these sides of myself that needs this or wants this, but I need to keep that in check.
And to some degree, that's a constant struggle.
In therapy, what you want people who are doing well to are able to actually give you genuine examples of where their schemas have been triggered and they recognize they flip into one of those modes, but they've then worked hard to recruit the healthy adult and say, what, I'm not going over the cliff today.
I'm going to go do something healthy. Go and connect,
versus somebody who comes in and says, no, nothing. No, you've been week after week, nothing to report. That's a real red flag, right? That's just not realistic. And again, context is king. You can understand why they do it, because they fear that to disclose that means they will be, risk managed in a much more punitive way. But the reality for the therapist is it flags progress when people can do that. It's just
like your involvement would be, I imagine the way that you write up your reporting would be, that the client is engaging well in the therapy, has shown a sort of openness in the treatment, these kind of things. I mean, you're going to be much more reassured by someone who can show that level of openness.
Yeah, and that they're managing it and it's realistic. They give particularized examples where you think, that's exactly how we want you to manage it, versus someone who's denying that the process exists.
For you, this is a red flag. This is
and you're like, okay, something that's been going on for 30 years, that it's just that's not realistic that it's going to disappear, and then you got to work hard to motivate people to not be in the deceitful, conning, manipulator mode, to be able to help them disclose and be honest about what's happening.
Yeah.
Very hard though, when they feel like they'll just get punished.
All right, guys. Well, that's been a fascinating sort of dive into the world of violent sexual behaviour, sadistic behaviour, the spectrum, BDSM, and all things in between. Just a reminder that we, of course, have our practitioner, schema therapy practitioner course and online platform where you can learn more about forensic schema therapy and schema therapy generally. And a reminder too that Lars and Shay have their 2 courses. They have Forensic Schema Therapy 1 and also Forensic Schema Therapy 2, which is called A Hero's Journey, up online at schematherapytrainingonline.com. Thanks for listening in, folks, and we'll see you in about a month.
We'll see you in about a month. Cheers.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
If you're interested in learning more about schema therapy, join us in A Hero's Journey, the schema therapy sessions at schematherapytrainingonline.com.